I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. Even with the hundreds, no, thousands of podcasts out there competing for your attention, there is absolutely nothing else like SKALD. For more than a year and a half, I've written and recorded a brand new episode of this ongoing sword and sorcery serial every single week. And what's more, I do all of them in one single, flawless take. This episode picks up right where the last one left off. But don't feel like you have to start at the beginning. Instead, just dive right in with this episode, the best one yet. Then, once you're hooked, go back and listen to the episodes you've missed, or pick up the reasonably priced prose volumes available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD. Part 88. Enleth gagged. She coughed. She wheezed. She bent at the knees and struggled to pull air into her lungs, struggled to find something to breathe, something fresh, something clean, something that wasn't infested with that awful, mephitic stench. And her subjects, the warriors and archers and war priests and mages that she had brought with her, her kingdom's finest warriors, they fared no better. They were all disgusted and weakened by the potent miasma that hung heavy in those yellow-lit corridors. They all gagged. They all coughed. They all wheezed except for one, except for Harana, who had been there before, who had spent months, spent years of her life breathing in that foul air, had felt her vitality sapped, her life force weakened from breathing in that horrible stench day after day, over and over again. And that stench, that miasma, it had affected her. It had changed her, as it did all those who spent time breathing it in. You! Harana barked at a war priest. She spat venom at the coughing fool, the one who made to brace himself on a wall, but then stopped and thought better of it when he saw the foul, mysterious mold that covered it from floor to ceiling. Close up the portal before any of this filth creeps back into my realm. Enleth, refusing to be seen as weak in front of her soldiers, in front of her subjects, she forced down the bile that was rising up in her throat, and she straightened herself. Your realm? She glowered at her eldest daughter. I think you forget yourself, girl. Harana met her mother's gaze with an icy stare of her own. I've earned my birthright once again. I've brought you your nemesis, haven't I? Enleth snorted and immediately regretted it, as her senses were assaulted by more of that awful stench. She ran her fingers over the pommel of her exquisite sword, the pride of the duelsmiths. I'll believe it when I see him bleeding out at my feet. The war priest set to work, closing the portal, cinching shut that gaping hole between the realms, that forbidden portal across the sundered worlds, the warriors checked their weapons, the archers tested their bowstrings, and the mages worked to center themselves, to prepare for whatever threats might be found in that chaotic border realm. And as they did, as they readied themselves for combat, readied themselves for whatever they might be forced to face, the gnomes, too, were extremely busy. The undergnomes, those ridiculous, hideous little creatures, they were unbothered by the stench that surrounded them. They had spent their lives surrounded by boiling, bubbling sulfur, by the rotting carcasses of eons past. What was a foul smell to one such as them? Though their bulbous noses worked overtime, sniffing the air to get a read on this strange realm, the stench did not affect them. So they went about their business. They went about their dire tasks. They set to work preparing their creation, that engine of mindless death and destruction, a machine built in defiance of nature, morality, and decency, a device that existed for no other purpose than grisly, horrific slaughter. The cataclysmaton. Is it ready? Enleth growled at a nearby gnome, the same brave soul that had spoken to the queen previously. Time is of the essence. The gnome swallowed hard and answered. Almost, my queen. If you'll allow me, I would like to help with the preparations, to speed things along. Without speaking, Enleth waved her hand at the ridiculous little creature, and she scurried off to assist her fellows. Sharpening blades, adjusting fittings, greasing gears, and testing the Byzantine clockwork meant to drive the cataclysmaton's deadly movements. And when they were finished, when the cataclysmaton was fully prepared, when its workings had been refined in keeping with the gnome's meticulous mechanical standards, they opened it up, and they began to climb inside. Enleth had been wary of bringing the gnomes with them, of bringing them to that border realm, of trusting the ridiculous little creatures with such a dangerous, violent, crucial mission. But as they had explained to her, gently, painstakingly, the journey between worlds would wreak havoc upon their delicate, deadly machinery. Not only did time run differently across the sundered worlds, but the laws that acted on physical matter also varied ever so slightly amongst them. Not enough to affect the workings of a sword or bow, of course, but more than enough to cast the alignment of a device as dangerously delicate as the cataclysmaton into disarray. Plus, as Enleth well knew, as her advisors, her late advisors, had told her, had tried to lecture her on, whenever magic comes in contact with machinery, with the magic that springs forth from industry and intellect, chaos is sure to follow. And so, when the cataclysmaton forded that churning river that separates the sundered worlds, when it braved that breach and rolled into the border realm, it did not do so unscathed. It had to be repaired, realigned, adjusted. And the gnomes were the only ones who knew how to do it. And even if the gnomes had imparted their vast knowledge to some of Enleth's warriors and priests, as she had requested, even if they had been able to teach them to match their peerless technical prowess, there was still the matter of steering that monstrosity. Once again, Enleth had requested that the gnomes brief her warriors, her most trusted soldiers, to instruct them in how to control that mechanical abomination. But the gnomes, at their peril, had declined. And it wasn't because they didn't wish to be clear of the device. The undergnomes, even though they had willingly built the cataclysmaton, they still feared it. They still loathed the thought of what it would do once activated. No, they declined. They refused Enleth's wishes because her elves simply would not fit inside the machine. And even if they were able to squeeze themselves in, they would lack the maneuverability necessary to control the cataclysmaton. When she asked if the machine could not simply be made larger, big enough to accommodate elven frames, the gnomes pointed to their blueprints and diagrams, covered in illegible chicken scratch, and they buffeted their queen with technical babble and jargon that was far beyond her ability to desire or understand. Enleth had relented, not wishing to waste any more time with the ridiculous little creatures, not wishing to allow her quarry, the traitor, the assassin, the murderer, Maul, any additional chance to escape his punishment, to escape her retribution, to escape the cold, gleaming steel of her singing blade. And now she watched as the undergnomes scrambled into position. They climbed and they squished, sliding in amidst that arcane clockwork machinery, settling into small gaps between grinding gears and swinging levers. They huddled amidst those marvels of engineering, technology that, if gifted to one of the surface civilizations, if one of the surface civilizations could possibly wrap their brains around it, technology that would change their very way of life 10 times over. There were sheets of hardened steel to protect them, to protect the gnomes as well as that delicate, precise machinery. Sheets of steel hammered flat by countless blows of their gnomish hammers. No less than a dozen gnomes found their places within the cataclysmaton, taking up the handles and pumps that guided and steered that monstrosity. And when the last had climbed inside, when he had pulled the tiny hatch shut behind him and latched it shut, Enleth heard, coming from that massive machine, a tiny, incongruous voice. "We await your command, my queen." Enleth smiled to cover her nerves. She clenched her fists the better to ignore the anxious fluttering in her chest. She raised her head in order to push back the worry, the concern for what would happen when this forbidden machinery was let loose upon creation. And newly brimming with confidence, with excitement, she spoke. Then wait no longer. Begin. Deep within those sewers, those winding tunnels, those yellow-lit catacombs, Enleth's regal, commanding voice echoed off the walls, and it was soon joined by the nervous whispers and murmurs of her war priests, by the sniffling of her warriors, the ones who had no desire to breathe in any more of that fetid air than was utterly necessary. But soon, those murmurs and whispers gave way to another noise, a dusty exhalation of steam which shot out from the cataclysmaton at all angles, from all available gaps in its design, and the clanking, unnatural grinding of gears joined it. And to that mechanical call, there came a primal response, a pounding, pulsing rhythm that emanated from somewhere above, from somewhere on the surface of that border realm. Harana looked up, scowling as bits of stone and ancient dirt loosened themselves from the ceiling. That's them, the centaurs. They aimed to take the city center, to fell the wall of tears. Though the cataclysmaton frightened her, though it was wholly unnatural and filled her with an unspeakable dread and anxiety, Enleth knew that her soldiers' eyes were upon her. She knew that she had to make a good, a proud, a noble, a brave example for them. So she strode toward the cataclysmaton, issuing her orders not to the gnomes within, but to the machine itself. You heard her. They're attacking the walls. Go, now. Prove your worth to me. Eager to demonstrate their value, the gnomes obeyed. They pulled their levers and they twisted their knobs. They filled the furnace deep in the cataclysmacon's door with fuel. They funneled the steam throughout its workings, and they brought that lurching, mechanical monstrosity to life. Enleth watched with a mix of pride and terror as the machine went to work, as it forced itself off its wheels and onto a set of asymmetrical limbs, legs with joints unseen in the natural world or even in nightmares. A design created not for beauty, not for aesthetics, not even for survival, but for meting out death and destruction in as expedient, as terribly efficient a manner as possible. Enleth watched with pride and terror. Pride in what she had birthed into the world, in this never-before-seen specimen, this perfect engine of devastation. She was proud, but like all parents, she was also fearful. She was assailed by a dark, twisting feeling that sat down hard, sat down deep in her stomach. The feeling, the knowledge that what she had created, what she had allowed to be brought into the world, made all her kind obsolete. But it wasn't the time for existential considerations. Leave those for after the battle. Leave them for the bards who would write the tale of her victory, of her conquest, of her revenge upon Maul and her taking of Ravenna, her seizure of that entire border realm. Let them deal with the consequences. Let her descendants deal with the fallout. Let Harana and her siblings manage the chaos that she had set loose upon the world. Bequeath to them a legacy of chaos and struggle and strife. Because is that not what all parents do? Is it not what her father, in his foolish leniency, in his allowing Maul to live, to continue breathing, is that not what he had done to her? So she watched. She directed her warriors and her war priests, directed her archers and her clerics to guard the hallways. Harana assured her that this section of the sewers was abandoned, and given the smell, that awful, noxious stench, Enleth could see why. But she could take no chances. She would take no chances. She could not allow the Vermin Prince or any of his followers to interfere with her plans, to interfere with the massive engine of destruction digging up in to the ceiling. It was slow going at first. Of course it was. The Cataclysmaton was tasked with digging through solid rock, digging through the bedrock which that convulsing city, Ravenna, had been built upon, the heavy, invincible granite that had been the city's immovable foundation for eons. At first, the Cataclysmaton's blades and drills simply smashed against the rock, filling the hallways with a new sound, an insufferable scraping, one accompanied by yellow sparks that were quickly lost in the hallway's jaundiced light. But soon enough, as the Cataclysmaton picked up speed, as the gnomes grew comfortable with the controls, as they heaped more and more fuel into the furnace, the machine began to make headway. At first, it was just a rock here or there, a boulder that bounced off the Cataclysmaton's metal hide as it careened to the floor, sending warriors, priests, archers, and clerics scattering, sending everyone scattering except for Enleth, who looked on, transfixed, heedless of the danger around her, watching her creation do her bidding. She stood and looked up, gazing at the heavens she could not see, the skies that were blocked, occluded from her vision, and she waited. She waited eagerly, excitedly, for that monstrous machine to breach the surface, to begin her conquest of Ravenna, her conquest of that border realm. For too long, the sundered worlds had lived, had reveled, had wallowed in chaos, and now it was she, Queen Enleth, the queen of the elves, who would finally weld them back together, who would bring them to heel, who would instill, finally, law and order throughout that teeming, terrible creation. She watched as the Cataclysmaton, digging its terrible legs into that solid rock, bracing itself in the tunnel it excavated, watched as it made steady progress toward the surface. She watched as the Cataclysmaton, exhibiting a shocking, stunning dexterity, managed to not only cut away the rock, to not only propel itself upward, but to leave a winding, sloping ramp, one that Enleth marched up boldly, her subjects following as close as they dared and as far as they thought their queen would allow. That growing tunnel was filled with a deafening, cacophonous noise, The pounding of the centaur's hooves, the clash of steel upon rock, and the strained voices of the elves who had to shout to be heard over the noise. But suddenly, that raucous din was interrupted by a heavy cracking, one louder than any that had come before, and Enleth soon heard gnomish voices shouting, crying, giving out frantic warnings as the cataclysmaton swung to the side, giving a wide berth to a massive rock that came plummeting down toward it. And covering the rock, scrambling to stay standing, struggling to climb over one another to get back to the surface, were centaurs. Centaurs that abandoned their clubs, their spears, and their bows to panic and grasp for anything constant, for anything stable. But the gnomes had done their jobs well. Their measurements had been perfect, and the pit was more than wide enough for that massive boulder to fall through it without complication. Enleth and her soldiers watched, the bloodlust growing within them as that rock, covered in centaurs, plummeted past them and crashed down to the ground below, where a handful of Enleth's rear guard finished off any centaurs that were still breathing. The way cleared, the surface breached. Enleth raised her head once again and gazed upward. But the skies, the heavens, they were still hidden to her, blocked out by the whirring buzz of steel, of swinging blades and spikes, and a thick red mist that flew up from the disgusting gore of mangled horseflesh that the cataclysmaton left in its wake. The centaurs weren't the only threat that confronted the cataclysmaton upon the surface. No, there was another. There was a woman, a shining, dazzling presence that towered over the centaurs, that twisted and turned, spinning through the air, her long, luxurious, braided hair twirling around her. The centaurs, they seemed almost as fearful of her as they were of the cataclysmaton. And with good reason. Because every time those braids connected, every time they kissed a centaur, the unfortunate horse beast was left with a gaping, weeping wound, a grisly slice that never failed to find a spurting artery or a pulsing vein. The woman was gorgeous, and more than that, she was divine. She was not of that world, not of that border realm, or rather, was not of what it had become. She was a visitor from an age long gone, a relic from a past that had been forgotten long ago. But she had returned, and the sight of her was enough to dazzle all those fortunate enough to lay eyes upon her beauty and her glory. Enleth looked upward. She gazed toward the heavens, and she saw what she had always wanted to see, but had never allowed herself to wish for. She saw a god, a dazzling, dancing, glorious goddess, a demigod at the height of her powers, a demigod in the midst of her ascendancy, her true ascendancy. But more importantly, more crucially, Enleth saw possibility. She saw another way. She saw an alternative to the bloody path that she had carved out for herself. She stood in a daze, staring at the woman, as the woman, in turn, looked down in horror upon those endlessly slashing blades, those perverse spinning drills, looked down upon the cataclysmaton. And as Enleth looked upward, clenching the hilt of her sword, struggling to steady herself, her daughter, Harana, leaned in close and whispered, because even though she knew that she was in the presence of something special, something divine, still, she feared. Mother, what is she? Enleth shook her head, breaking herself out of her trance. She's collateral damage. Onward! Stop for nothing but my word! And the gnomes, fearing their queen's wrath more than any blasphemy, more than any punishment, earthly or divine, that would come with the inconceivable sin of deicide. They obeyed. They moved forward. They moved upward, and those long, powerful, elegant limbs, those growing, twisting, living braids, they were powerless in the face of the cataclysmaton. The elves, endless followers, her hand-picked warriors, even Harana, they didn't have the stomach for it. They turned away. They looked down with eyes full of tears and hearts full of loss. But Enleth, she knew better. She did as all leaders, as all good leaders, as all true leaders must. She looked upon the destruction she had wrought, looked upon it with a stiff upper lip. She marched forward into the maelstrom, into the chaos that could, she hoped, bring order, and she unsheathed her sword, holding it aloft with a steady hand. Thanks for listening to this, the very best episode of SKALD yet. Every week, I read you a positive review that the show has received on iTunes or Stitcher. But here's the problem. Once again, even though I implore you to go write reviews every single week, even though it would only take a moment of your time, that it would cost you nothing, I once again find myself here with no new reviews to read. SKALD is a unique, strange, very specific niche podcast. I'm fully aware of the fact that it's absolutely not for everyone. It's only for smart, passionate, interesting people who appreciate this brutal, weird, psychedelic throwback approach to fantasy storytelling. People like you. But in order for other people like yourself to find the show, in order for us to keep spreading the good word of the only story that matters, I need your help. And that means positive reviews on iTunes and Stitcher. In addition to positive reviews, you can also help get the word out about SKALD by posting about it on social media. Every Tuesday, when a brand new episode of The Only Story That Matters hits your podcast feed, post about how awesome it is on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, wherever you like to do your yammering. You can even just share my posts if that's easier for you. And make sure to tell people you know in real life, too. Not everyone is going to listen to SKALD, but everyone needs to know about it. And if you love SKALD as much as I do, if you want to see it continue going and growing, please consider making like in the days of old. Don't just listen to the bard regaling you with fascinating, thrilling, thought-provoking tales. Throw him a few bucks. It's easy to do via Patreon, a service that allows you to set up small, monthly, automatic donations to help support the stuff you love. Stuff like SKALD. Head to patreon.com/SKALD today. For more information on me, the SKALD Prose volumes, my comic book writing, signed copies of my work, my wrestling talk show, Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more, head to aubreysitterson.com. And make sure to come find me on social media. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Snapchat. Tag me in all your SKALD praise so I can shamelessly share it. Finally, my weekly recommendation. Outside of all the wrestling I watch for Straight Shoot, I don't have much time to stare at the television. But lately, there's a show that's really been making me laugh. Son of Zorn. The basic high concept is that there's this animated He-Man-esque character, Zorn, who's traveled to America where he's trying to forge a relationship with his estranged son. It stars Cheryl Hines and Tim Meadows as Zorn's ex-wife and her new fiancé, respectively. And it is hysterical. Zorn most definitely has some Maulish tendencies. Find it on Hulu today. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.